As we continue to consider and reflect on these important issues, I would like to invite Dr. Roman Solovey, who is the regional editor for Langham literature in Eastern and Central Europe. So he makes life more difficult for those who write books and monographs on theology. And thank God for these people who keep us motivated and keep us on schedule as we write articles and publications. He is also director of the East European Institute of Theology, which is located in Lviv currently. Roman, the floor is yours. We're listening to you intently. Good evening, dear colleagues. I'm going to take 1 or 2 minutes of your time, and I would like to thank, first of all of those who were involved in the publication of this book, which is a large book, 800 pages. The Lausanne movement many years ago started consultations with missions in global diasporas. In this book, you will be able to familiarize yourself with the history of this book. We have less than 50 million people who live in diaspora. Most of them are refugees. And even before the onset of the full-scale invasion into Ukraine, an important issue of the Lausanne movement, and the result of this work, of many consultations, conferences, was this book that was published by Langham Publishing. We have a representative of this organization, and not just Langham Publishing, but Langham Partnership, which supports many educational publishing initiatives that deal with the Western world. And with the support of Langham Publishing, this book was published in 2015 in the English language, and it became the primary resource for missions in diasporas for evangelical churches of the world. And after the start of the full-scale Russian invasion into Ukraine, together with Mr. Lewis, the director of Langham Publishing, we decided how Langham Publishing can help Ukrainian churches in their ministry. And the first book that we published was the Overcoming Trauma, which was the first high-quality resource, which was distributed in several thousands of copies and helped our churches and pastors to organize this work and lay the biblical theological foundation as we attempt to help those who try to cope and cope with their traumas, loss of their loved ones, loss of their homes. And approximately at the same time, we also realized that there were a lot of people who went to diaspora, and we realized that they also needed support and counseling. And the government of Ukraine and the president also emphasized that it's very important that Ukrainian churches provided spiritual support and care for these people who ended up abroad and who also suffer from severe trauma. And we started working on this book several years ago as the most high-quality resource for these purposes. And over the course of time, we were able to bring it to completion at the end of this year. I would like to thank personally to Langham Publishing, which also provided copyright for the interpretation and also provided a grant to interpret. I'd like to also thank Galina Bezuk, the translator, to literary editor Ms. Borodinska, to Lyudmila Okunova, and Andrei Trehu for making the layout of the book. I also would like to thank the Ukrainian editors, including Alexander Yechenko and Ksenia Trofimchuk. I also would like to thank our partners who invested into this. our institute, Odessa Theological Seminary, as well as the Bible School, the Ukrainian Migrant School. It was very important that Ukrainian diaspora also invested in this project. I would like to thank all of those involved, and I would like to encourage and support and call on all participants of this event and other future readers, and recommend to receive this resource that and we hope and pray that they will also be used both by theological schools and by wider audiences, and we are sure that it will help to organize and streamline work of all those who serve all Ukrainians who ended up abroad. And would like to thank you for taking part in this event. We will have a few very meaningful and interesting presentations. Thank you.
Дякую, Роман
Thank you,
Павлович.
Roman, for this additional information. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Chris Wright. He is an Anglican minister, a missions specialist, and an expert in the Old Testament. He received his degree from Cambridge University, and for many years he worked as the Lankan publishing director. And now an international director of Lankan Partnership is Dr. Riyad Hasid from Lebanon. And now Dr. Wright is an international ambassador of Lankan Publishing, and he is an author of many books, including God's Mission, which was very impactful on missiology and missions education. Dr. Christopher Wright was among the first ones who responded to the large-scale Russia's invasion against Ukraine. In the first days of war, while many church structures took a pause and really thought how to respond to that, and many are still thinking, he really was among the first ones to respond in our Protestant environment, Protestant community.
Brother Christopher, the floor is yours. Please welcome.
Thank you, Taras, and hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you today and to share something from the Bible in this area of diaspora, migration, refugees, and so on from an Old Testament perspective. It is a joy to join this occasion, particularly with the translation of the book, Scattered and Gathered. I'm so glad that that's been done into Ukrainian and is available there. So it's a pleasure to be with you, and I hope that you can all hear me. I will try, for the translator's sake, I will try not to go too fast. Now, I've got a PowerPoint, which I will bring up. Where we go here, share. I trust I can share my screen. I think this will work. There we are. I hope that can somebody give me a thumbs up to show that that is actually on the screen. Is that working? Good. Okay, thank you. So I gave this the title, God Loves People on the Move, Migration and Refugees and an Old Testament Perspective. By which I don't mean, of course, that God loves all the reasons why people are on the move, because the Bible shows very clearly that people can be migrant or moving for some good reasons, but also for some very bad reasons. So it's not that God simply loves what's happening, but that God is particularly involved with those who are, for various reasons, on the move from their own homeland. I think we all know that Jesus said that the first and second greatest commandments in the law were, first, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength, and secondly, love your neighbor as yourself. The second great commandment of the law, love your neighbor. But I wonder, did you also know that those same two books in the Old Testament from which those commands came, Deuteronomy, love the Lord your God, and Leviticus 19, love your neighbor, also include the command, you shall love the foreigner, the migrant, the immigrant, the alien in your midst, and love him as yourself. In fact, it says that in Leviticus 19, as a balance to love your neighbor as yourself, it says you shall love the foreigner, the alien, as yourself. It's a remarkable fact that that occurs twice, both in Deuteronomy and in Leviticus. And as I hope to show over these next few minutes, the Old Testament backs up that basic command to love the alien, the migrant, the refugee or foreigner, with a whole host of specific laws and protections, which are really quite remarkable in their extent to what they say. But first of all, to say that the word for foreigner is the word ger or gerim. And I'll come back to that when we look at some of the laws. But here's a point which many people don't realize is that, let me move this forward. There we go. That migration or people being on the move is almost like a thread all the way through the Old Testament. It's as if the Bible is saying that God, the God of Israel, has been a God on the move. God moves with people, and God is in charge of people movements all the way through the Old Testament. And so even when we think of the very beginning, Abraham himself, the founder, as it were, of God's people to whom he made the great promises, begins by saying, do you remember when he was trying to buy a field in which to bury his wife? He says to the Hittites who were in the land of Canaan at that time, in Genesis 23, verse 4, he says, I am a foreigner and a stranger among you. Well, they actually responded to him quite generously. They said, you don't need to buy land, we'll give it to you. And Abraham insists. He purchased the field with the cave of Machpelah there. But even that is interesting, that Abraham, the founder of the people of Israel, and in a sense our father in God, is there in that land as a foreigner, as a stranger, as an immigrant, quite literally an immigrant from Mesopotamia. And then Exodus 2, verse 22, Moses names his son, one of his sons, Ger-shom, which means I have become a foreigner. Ger is the word for foreigner, Sham in that land. And so he names his son as a way of expressing his own sense of being an alien, a migrant. Whether he means the foreign land, was that Egypt, where he'd been before, or is it Midian, where he now is? And in a sense, it could be either, because Moses remains on the move with God, even in his old age. And then there are a number of places in the book of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, there's a whole list of small nations, Moab, Edom, Ammon, and the Zamzummites, whoever they were, nobody knows. And in each case, God says to the Israelites, don't go and take any of their land, because I, says God, I, the Lord God of Israel, have given their land to them. I moved them from this place to that place. So even all these migrations and movements that are there in Deuteronomy chapter 2, God says, I did that. I've been moving people around on the chessboard of history long before he moved Israel from Egypt through the wilderness into the promised land. And then in chapter 23, verse 7, Moses says to the Israelites, do not despise an Egyptian. Well, we know that Egypt is often seen as the enemy in the Old Testament, but God says, don't despise an Egyptian, because you were residents as foreigners in their land. So this little law there in Deuteronomy 23, there's this memory in the mind of Israel that at one time they had gone to Egypt. Jacob and his brothers had gone to Egypt basically as famine refugees, as asylum seekers, and they had been welcomed by the then Pharaoh, who had welcomed them and given them protection and indeed given them land to live in. They never forgot that. There were many other memories of Egypt, the oppression, the slavery, and so on, but that one never faded. And then at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 26, verse 5, the Israelite farmer, every time he has a harvest, is to bring an offering of the first fruits of his harvest and to bring it to the sanctuary and to put it down before the priest. And then he makes a confession, a statement of faith. And it begins, "My father was a wandering Aramean, but God brought us out of Egypt." The very history of Israel begins with wanderings and migration. God makes that point explicitly to the Israelites in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 23. It's right in the middle of a chapter which is all about their economic laws, the laws of the redemption of land or slaves, and the Jubilee law of the return of people to their land after 50 years. And in the middle of that chapter, God says something about the land of Israel. He said, the land must not be sold permanently. That is just like a commercial product, because, says God, the land is mine. God says, I own the land. And you, God says to the people of Israel, you are like resident aliens, tenants in my land. You're not the owners of the land. You just are there, as it were, by my gift. You are resident aliens in the land that you've been given. You are like immigrants who've come into this land and had refuge there. And then there are other stories, of course. We know the story of Ruth, who comes, well, even before Ruth herself comes, Elimelech and her mother-in-law Naomi had migrated, hadn't they, from Bethlehem to Moab because of famine. And then they settle there, and then there's marriages there, and then there are deaths in Moab, and then she comes back. Naomi comes back to Bethlehem, but Ruth comes with her. She's a Moabite immigrant. And remarkably, she is treated well and generously by Boaz, but he's very aware that that might not have been the case, because he has to warn his own staff, his servants, to treat her well and not to molest her and to make sure that she has the gleaning. That's Ruth. Then Amos chapter 9, is a remarkable verse where God says to the Israelites, the kingdom of Israel, are you not to me like the Syrians whom I brought up from the east, and the Philistines who I brought up from Crete? In other words, yes, I brought you here to the land, but I've been bringing other people around as well. This is something that God is doing. So all the way through the Old Testament, then, we find God involved with migrant people, directly or indirectly. And it doesn't stop with the Old Testament, because Jesus himself, we always remember that Jesus became a refugee in Egypt. And it's probable that he was already a little toddler, a little boy, because we remember that Herod wanted to kill the boys in Bethlehem, and he killed all those who are under 2 years old, which suggests that this is just a little bit after Christmas. This isn't Joseph and Mary going to Egypt with a baby Jesus, but probably with a little boy of about 18 months or 2 years old. And we all know that migration, being a refugee, being homeless, can be very traumatic on children, even before they know what's happening. They can be very disturbed by it. And Jesus went through that and had a migration to Egypt and then came back. There is dispersion in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 8, verse 1, where the believers are scattered because of persecution. And then Peter, 1 Peter chapter 1, applies this word to all believers. He said, we are aliens, we are scattered abroad. We are like resident migrants or refugees in other lands. So what I'm trying to say in this opening part is that really the theme of migration is nothing new. And it's not something that has taken God by surprise or should take us by surprise. But what it does tell us is that God is intensely interested in this issue. God is there, he's involved, and it's a major issue of God's mission. A few years ago, I was in Toronto because I was asked to speak at one of the large Chinese churches in Toronto. And as you know, Chinese diaspora is all over the world. And there are huge numbers of Chinese immigrants there in Canada. And the question they asked me to speak about was, how can we be a missional, ethnic, immigrant church in this land? Immigrant, ethnic minority, but how can we be missional? And I began my talk on that topic by saying, really, you know, there's nothing strange about that. You are really what all believers have been all through the ages. God is mixing and moving people around. And so to be ethnic minority, migrant and immigrant in another country, that's normal for Christians. But of course, I realize that there's a very, very big difference between Chinese expats and diaspora living in Toronto and the kind of refugee displacement that you're dealing with there in Ukraine and indeed other parts of the Middle East and Europe. I'm not trying to make an equation or an equivalence, but simply the fact that that is part of what God has done. Now, let me move on then to, as I said, the biblical word to describe this is the word ger, or in plural, gerim. And the way in which the Old Testament uses this most commonly is that clearly it's describing people who were mainly what we would have called immigrants or migrants, although they will have settled in the land of Israel. But they did not only own any land, they were very vulnerable to exploitation or abuse. The literature that I've read said that many of them would have become gerim as a result of some kind of social or political upheaval, whether that by war or famine or oppression or plague or some kind of misfortune would have driven them from their own land, and they had come to settle in the land of Israel. And what's fascinating is that the laws that God gave to Israel speak about foreigners, migrants, immigrants, almost more often than any other category of people in the laws of the Old Testament, in the Torah. And I just wanted to quickly take you through 8 areas where God gives special attention to those who were in this category. Migrants, immigrants, aliens, refugees, in whatever way we describe them. Here are some aspects of that. Let me move forward. Israel's laws on these 8 points. First of all, protection from general abuse or oppression. 2 verses. I'll read them. I hope the translator is still able to keep up with me. But Exodus chapter 22, verse 1, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt, says God. And in Leviticus 19:33, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. Very general, no details, just be kind to refugees and foreigners. Don't oppress them. The second one was that they should be treated with justice, justice especially in the courts. In Exodus 23, verse 9, is in the context of the first 9 verses of that chapter, which are all about court procedures. There are regulations given to witnesses, to the participants in the case, and to the judges. And in that context, it says, again, do not oppress a foreigner, because you yourselves know what it feels like to be foreigners. You were foreigners in Egypt. And then Deuteronomy chapter 1, Moses said, I charged your judges, the elders in the land who would have been judging cases. I charged them, hear the disputes between your people and judge fairly, whether the case is between 2 Israelites or between an Israelite and a foreigner residing among you. Do not show partiality in judging, ethnic discrimination. There it is in the law of Israel. Maybe, 1,000 years before Christ. We still haven't got there today. And then Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 17 to 18, do not deprive the foreigner or the fatherless, the orphan, of justice, Do not take the cloak of a widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. In fact, I haven't put it on the screen there, but in Deuteronomy 27, I should have mentioned this, Deuteronomy 27, it says, cursed is anyone who withholds justice from a foreigner. Very serious language, because a curse was not just damn you or something. This was a serious invocation of God's judgment on those who would treat foreigners unjustly and exploit them. And then number 3, oops, go back one. Last few, I think. Oh, no, there we go. 2, 3, there we are. The benefit of Sabbath rest. Now, one of the major innovations of Israelite culture was, in a sense, the invention of the Sabbath. It was the greatest worker protection law in history because it was for the benefit of the workers, not just Israelite landowners, but slaves, servants, even animals. And it's very interesting that in all the laws telling the Israelites to keep a day of rest every week, it explicitly includes not just the Israelites and their servants, but also foreigners. So, for example, in Deuteronomy 5, verse 12 to 15, observe the Sabbath day, 6 days work, 7th day you rest. You will not do any work, nor your son, or your daughter, or your servants, or your ox, or your donkey, or any animal, or any foreigner residing among you, so that they may rest as you do. Very interesting. It doesn't say, you can all have a nice rest, just let all the foreigners do the work, all the immigrants. Yeah, they don't matter. No, they too must rest. So the benefit of Israel's legislation is extended even to those who were dependent laborers in their land. And then fourthly, it's interesting that the foreigners were included within Israel's worshipping life. And there's a whole list of laws here. By the way, these PowerPoint slides, I've said to Xenia that you can have them. So if you want, you can have these slides later. But for example, foreigners were allowed to join in the Passover in Exodus 12, so long as they were circumcised. They were to benefit from the 3-yearly tithe. That's to say, every 3rd year, all the produce of the land was to be tithed. They would keep 1/10 of that, and that became like a social fund, a sort of social security for the poor and the needy, including foreigners. They were included in the annual holidays. 3 weeks a year there were feasts, and they were included. They were included in the Day of Atonement, and when the covenant was being renewed in chapter 29. So in so many ways, God says to the Israelites, you must bring these people, even though they're foreigners, they can participate with you in all those expressions of the worship of the living God. Keeping going, number 5, one of my favorites is that they were to have fair employment. Again, this is one of those areas where in our modern life, I find, especially in my own country, that the treatment of foreigners, of migrants, is often so unfair, especially in the workplace. But God says about even Hebrew slaves, which were probably a kind of class of non-ethnic, not ethnic Israelites, but a class of people, they were to be given the benefit of freedom after a 6-year contract. They could be effectively given a redundancy package and released, as it were, into back into the workforce. Deuteronomy 24 explicitly says this. I'm now talking about an employee. I'll read Deuteronomy 24. Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing among you. Pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and they're counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry out to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. Not because you're murdering them or anything, but simply because you're not paying their wages. You'll be guilty of sin. It's a challenging chapter when we see so many people in our countries who are longing for a day's work, and then can be easily exploited, and the law seeks to protect them. And then sixthly, there is, of course, the gleaning rights, which we mentioned that Ruth was able to have, because these foreigners, they would not own the land, they didn't have a possession of the land. And so the Israelite farmer is told that when you harvest your crops or go to your olives or your grapes, then make sure that you leave some for widows and orphans and foreigners. They're explicitly included in those laws. Leave it for them, it says. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that's why I command you this day. And then seventhly is the right of asylum. This is to me one of the most remarkable laws in the Old Testament, that it says that, here I read it, Deuteronomy 23, verse 15 and 16, if a slave has taken refuge with you, that is, someone runs away from their master and comes to you, they're basically an asylum seeker, do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you wherever they like and whatever time they choose. Now, all right, maybe these slaves are not strictly speaking refugees like we might say, immigrants, but probably the reason why a slave would run away is because of some cruelty or some other injustice and oppression. And this law is the diametric opposite of almost all the laws about slaves in human history, which is that if a slave runs away, you send them back. Refoulement, send them back to where they came from, to their master. And God says, no, you don't. If they've run away, then let them live where they choose to. It's a most remarkable law of asylum there, right in the heart of Deuteronomy. And then finally, in this section, there's the equality before the law with the native born. Leviticus 19 says this, verse 34, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. In other words, the foreigner and the national must be treated with equality before the law, legal equality for all ethnic minorities. It's an incredible law right there in Leviticus 19. And then comes the words, love them as you love yourself, for you are foreigners in Egypt, and that's why I give you this law. So those are the 8 areas where migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers are given incredible levels of protection from God within his law. Now, we might say, well, why? And here are 3 reasons why God does that. First of all, because the character of God himself. God says in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 17 to 19, that he says, I am the Lord, the God of gods, Lord of gods, but he's the God who is among the widow, the orphan, the landless, the foreigner, and loves them and gives them food and clothing. And therefore, says God, that's what you must do. So the Israelites were commanded to imitate the character of the God of Israel. If this is the God you worship, then this is how you should behave. He is the God who is not just the God of the kings and the powerful and the presidents and the emperors. He is the God who you will find at the bottom of the heap among the landless and the familyless and the poor. So if you want to love the Lord your God, you'd better care for those people. It's imitation of God. But secondly, it's also a reflection of their own history. Israel were constantly reminded that they had once been in this position, that their role had been as asylum seekers in Egypt, and then an oppressed ethnic minority in Egypt who were being exploited by Pharaoh, and God brought them out of there. And indeed, God says to them repeatedly, it's because this is what I've done for you, that this is what I want you to be like for others. One of the most, to me, the most galling, nasty aspects of some of our Western nations, and of course, as you know, I'm British, I live in the United Kingdom, is the way in which we in the West, most of whose nations were built and founded by immigrants over centuries of immigration. I mean, for Britain, it was the Danes and the Anglo-Saxons and the Celts and so on. And there are whole countries like the United States and Australia, which wouldn't even exist today, hardly, at least in their current state, if it weren't for immigration. Yet it's these very same countries who sort of pull up the drawbridge and say, no more, we can't have any more refugees, when in fact we have a history of migration ourselves. That to me is very sad. And then finally, there's the blessing of covenant obedience that God says to the Israelite, or rather, the Israelite farmer says to God in Deuteronomy 26, they say, Lord, I've given my portion, my first fruits, I've given this to the poor and the needy and the foreigner, and therefore, because I've given what you have given to me, and I've shared it with those who are needy, including the foreigners, therefore I ask, Lord, that you would continue to bless us and to bless your land in covenant relationship. So the sharing of covenant blessing in Deuteronomy 26 is a condition of being blessed by God. If I wanted to finish off very quickly, this is getting to the end. In the prophets, when you get to the prophets, this is one area where they again and again and again, they condemn the Israelites for their treatment of foreigners. But the first one on there is interesting. In Isaiah 16, the prophet Isaiah mourns the fact that the Moabites have just been attacked and have become refugees. And it says this, hide the fugitives, do not betray the refugees, let the Moabite refugees stay with you and be their shelter. So there's a prophet appealing to the Israelites to give shelter to even the enemy Moabites, who are now refugees. Jeremiah chapter 7 says to the Israelites, if you will change your ways and actions and deal justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless and the widow, and shed innocent blood in this place, then I will let you go on living here. The foreigner in there. Ezekiel chapter 22 speaks about how the princes of Israel, that is their government, their elite, their rich and powerful people, he says, look at what they're using their power to shed blood. Look at how they have treated their own fathers and mothers with contempt, and there they have oppressed the foreigner and mistreated the orphans. And finally, at the very end of the Bible, in Malachi chapter 3, verse 5, God says, God says, I'm coming to put you on trial, and I will testify against sorcerers, adulterers, perjurers, those who defraud laborers of their wages, those who oppress widows and fatherless, and those who deprive the foreigners among you of justice and do not fear me, says the Lord. So all I can say in closing is this is a matter that God really, really cares about. It's in the laws, it's in the prophets, it's in the Psalms. God cares for migrants, for refugees and foreigners. And therefore, I would say we have every biblical motivation for doing the same. And that's where I'll stop.
Дякуємо доктору Крістоферу
Thank you,
Райту. Ми
Dr.
бачимо,
Christopher Wright. As we can
з
see
його
from his
презентації,
presentation,
як Соломон,
as King Solomon once said, everything that was, it still is under the sun. So same format, but we can see the same patterns repeat time and again over the course of human history for thousands of years. And as one of the advocates of this phenomenon wrote, the same Lord who prevented a Moabite refugee from becoming a member of Israel's society, but at the same time, the same Lord allowed Ruth to become part of Jesus's genealogy.
That's right, yeah.
And she also became a refugee. He left her nation and her land and joined the Israelite nation. Now I would like to introduce Dr. of Theology Ivan Rusin. He is the Evangelical Theological Seminary president. It is one of those schools that focuses on interesting theological projects and developments. First of all, it's the urbanistic mission, or the mission of the city, and the theology of citizenship, a very complex theological concepts, the position of Christian in church, in Christian community, in churches. Once again, is city missiology and citizenship missiology. How do we reconcile and combine these two kingdoms, the earthly kingdom and the spiritual heavenly kingdom? And now I would like to invite Ivan. The floor is yours. We are ready to listen to what you have to say. Thank you, Taras. I'm very happy about this opportunity to take part in this Zoom meeting. I would like to thank the authors they are not part of this meeting, but they were behind this writing of this book. I also would like to thank Roman and Hitchinka for making this happen, for translating and publishing this book. It is a matter of God's mission, matter of diaspora, and it greatly inspires me that I see so many participants today. The publication of this book is an important contribution to the ministry of Christian churches in Ukraine. It will allow us to understand the role of diaspora and will foster discussions of Ukrainian Christians, both in Ukraine and abroad. Diaspora missiology is an important step in the development of missiology proper. The publication of this book in Ukrainian coincides with in-depth rethinking of missiology through the prism of the large-scale war. This war posed a great deal of new questions to the church, and the church is struggling to provide holistic, mission-minded answers to these questions. And it occurs not only at the level of ideas, but also at the level of practices. The war changed very many things. And when I think about diaspora, I think of the danger of romanticizing this phenomenon. Indeed, migration happens for a whole array of reasons. Of course, it's a path of following your own economic benefit, but very often it becomes the consequence of evil. They're not just people are not just migrating; they're fleeing, attempting to save their lives, the lives of their children. And there's very few romantic things about that portion of migration. So our discussion of migration needs to be realistic and it needs to be holistic. And yet, most of all, I'm concerned with the following. Today, I had a chance to see and hear Mr. Yaroslav Vasilevich, the person who lost his wife and 3 of his daughters in September of this year. This family resided in Lviv. Today, Kiev was brutally attacked, survived a brutal missile attack. And I read that 506 bodies of fallen Ukrainian heroes were delivered in Ukraine. And it is this context where I'm posing this question of not just how we rationalize migration and give it some sort of sense, but how do we look for ways to stop the evil that is the underlying cause of this migration? What is the mission responsibility of the church in attaining and reaching global justice? Dr. Wright mentioned that God does not love all the reasons which cause people move. But what do we do about those reasons which God doesn't like? Diaspora missiology is impossible without these two concepts, the holistic God's mission and the heavenly kingdom, the kingdom of God. The holistic God's mission and the mission of the kingdom of God, it's not only about the consequences, but also about the underlying root causes. And we cannot discuss matters of the future without trying to solve issues of the past. We must think as Christians, what is church's mission as a participant in God's mission, as the kingdom community, how and to what God is causing us to, can we work with the reasons which cause the evil reasons which cause some of the migration. If we misconstrue or have incorrect understanding of God's mission, we may arrive at the wrong consequences. I'm inspired by the words of Apostle Peter, who says, Peter, the apostle of Paul, to those who are chosen in diaspora, they are not just refugees or migrants, they are the chosen people. And I believe the holistic understanding of God's mission, the understanding of mission as something that is done through the prism of God's election, God's calling, it will allow us to have the instruments and tools, not just improve our understanding of diaspora mission, but our role in attaining the ultimate justice. So thank you once again for to those who made their contribution in the publication of this book. I believe that we will soon have more participants and more meaningful contributions in this work, in this realm. So thank you for your attention. Thank you, Ivan. I would like to remind everyone that Ukrainian Evangelical Theological Seminary, and you will not be able to read this on Facebook. It cares for a lot of needy people and a lot of internally displaced people. They provide at least 1,000 hot meals a week to those people who need those. This is a very quiet ministry that they have been carrying for 2.5 years after the deoccupation of Kiev Oblast. So Ivan is sharing something not just from his theological perspective, but it is the portion of his ministry that he humbly didn't mention. I also would like to introduce another speaker, Alexander Hitchenko, Doctor of Philosophy, St. Andrews alumnus. Alexander defended his thesis, and we are now getting ready to publish his monograph on missions. My wife has the honor to edit it, and I also often take part in this work. And Odessa Seminary, in their research, also focus on the theology of invalidity, of the theology of disabled people. We are thankful for their contribution in this, as we have tens of thousands of people, both civil and veterans, who became disabled because of the war. So Alexander, we would like to listen to what you have to say.
Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm very excited to be a part of presentation of this book. I'm sorry I only have it present in English, but it is still so very important to see this book available in Ukrainian quite soon, ready to be shipped. I remember when we started talking about translation this book about 2022, maybe the end of it, and then we were looking for for a translator in 2023, and then finally we started the entire process. It's a thick book and it's a unique book, but it is also a very important book, considering the context that we currently live in. So after the 2 years of hard work, we have great results. The book is ready for the reader. Praise be the Lord, and thank be to all who were part of this process. Well, why is this book so important for us in our context? And the answer to this question has a couple of factors, I suppose. I would like to point out just two. First of all, as Roman Sylvie has already mentioned, this book gives a Ukrainian reader um, an overview of the most poignant questions and models that current nowadays missiology works with. As part of my job for quite a long time, I was involved in different capacity in developing and application of educational program. And I have been working with popularization of missionary mindset and activity throughout churches of Evangelical Christian Baptist Union here in Ukraine. From my own perspective, from my own experience, I know that a lot of educational programs here use categories and use ideas that reflect the state of missiology about the first half of 20th century, maybe a little later bits of it, perhaps. And oftentimes I see the use of words as home mission or foreign mission or window 1040. Sometimes we hear about these categories. They are useful, but you have to understand that the situation in the world is currently a good deal different. And when we use those ideas, they might not necessarily be applicable nowadays. And teaching our students using books that are no longer applicable prepares them for situation that is no longer present. Do keep in mind that in 1990, Anglican bishop and the head of Church Missionary Society, Michael Nazir Ali, wrote From Everywhere to Everywhere, where he noted the change more, not just from overall quality, but also the weight of Christian population from the north to the global south. And he noted active actions of communities, not just from south to north and north to south. And I quote, now, however, perhaps for the first time in centuries, Christian mission is not going along in the same direction as economic, technological, cultural, and political influence. Certainly, a great deal of cross-cultural mission is sent from the South to other parts of the South. This is itself is a challenge to the usual North-South flow of information, skills, and money. There is, however, evidence that Christians in the South are increasingly interested in mission to the North. End of quote. Another important factor that we really should take into account is quickening of migration processes in the last 50 years. In 2005, missiologists Michael Pocock, Helen Van Reenen, and Douglas McConnell noted and underscored the point that active migration happens from that region previously described as 1040 window. And because of that migration, people from other religious denominations end up in historically Christian communities. I quote, Migration brings non-Christians into areas more strongly Christian and more open to evangelism and religious change. A Hindu Indian in England or a Muslim Turk in Germany may not face ostracism from the community, loss of employment, and family violence if he or she converts to Christianity. Migration also brings vibrant Christians from Africa and Caribbean to post-Christian areas of Europe, end quote. I've had uh, my trip to through Erasmus program, and I have seen in Europe a lot of people in churches on Sunday that don't look local Europeans. A lot of diaspora churches are gathering too. I've seen communities work with I've seen local communities work with diaspora communities, and I see that diaspora communities at the end of the day began influence them back. So migration processes flow not just from the south to north and from the south to south, or even from north to south. There are many reasons for migration, most prominent ones being economic reasons, security, safety, and climate. Some people choose to migrate, some are forced to because they cannot stay in the community they grew up in. For Ukrainians, migration phenomenon and phenomenon of internal displacement is far too known. And this year's document about world migration from World Migration Report, International Organization for Migration. This is a fresh one concerning year 2024. It's a big report, a lot of information that's useful actually for the work that we do. So this year's report, I quote, "The full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation in early 2022 signaled a pivotal shift for the world, with some arguing that it, I quote, marked an abrupt end to 30 years of globalization and all the international cooperation that made this possible," end of quote in the quote. The immediate impact on Ukraine and Europe continue to be felt by millions of people, while the global impacts have touched many more, as the consequences of the war ripple through global food security, energy security, international law, multilateralism, military strategy, and alliances. End quote. So I would really encourage you to take a closer look on the website of this report. But the book, Scattered and Gathered, also gives us an insight in this reality that's been going on in the last decade or so. And another factor of the importance of this book, as it gives us ideas, the latest ideas that are circulating in missiology community, and it also gives us tools, sociological, demographical, missiological, and strategical, that help us analyze our own situation and plan the strategy that leans on migrational processes for the sake of spreading the gospel. Do keep in mind that you don't have to necessarily read it from first page to the last page in order. truth be told, it's kind of a walkthrough to encourage our own thinking, to understanding of the tools available, but it all comes down to this: to better understanding of our mythological context, the better use of tools for the gospel preaching and testimony of the kingdom of the Lord. For example, first section leans on phenomenological realities and trends of global diaspora. Section 2 describes biblical and theological foundation for diaspora missiology. Third section helps plan strategic direction for diaspora missions. And if you're already working with the local churches, if you're a pastor of the church that works with refugees, you can put the section 4 to better use that touches on the mission of the church in global diaspora. The fifth one leans on regional and national case studies in the diaspora missions. Actually, I want to express today both pity and hope. Pity because, unfortunately, this book does not include a Ukrainian chapter about Ukrainian diaspora mission. But I also have hope that it will be written not only with the words in a book, but through action in the lives of people, wherever Ukrainian believers may end up. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alexander, especially for pointing out the sections of the book regarding the issues that people might be looking the answers to. Ksenia, if I understand correctly, we are switching over to Q&A session. And before we go on into that, I would like to invite Alexander Marusyak, if he is present here, because he does work in UN mission towards Ukrainian refugees. Perhaps you would like to share your experience, your insight. We'd love to hear from you. Alexander Marusyak, are you here? Well, unfortunately, looks like he is not present right now. Very well. I mean, not really well, but that means we can move on to the two questions we have in our chat. The first one I would like to use is from Lyudmila Filipovich. She is probably a mother figure for a lot of theologians here in Ukraine, because she and her husband working together, if I remember correctly, she was of great assistant and a teacher during the PhD thesis writing. No, of Roman Solovey. Oh no, actually, they had thesis defense on the same day. Either way, she's an important person in our Ukrainian theological society. Are there any rules in Bible about inappropriate behavior of refugees or the hosts? Is there anything that's written more or less properly and worded well?
I think very little. I mean, David all the stories of David comes up against some foreigners in the community who seem to be hostile to him. But I would say that the emphasis of the text is more on his behavior towards two people who were foreigners in his kingdom, one of whom was Uriah fighting in his battles, and Uriah was a Hittite, and his wife Bathsheba, who presumably also was a Hittite, and he behaves very abominably, takes her wrongly and as an act of adultery, and then has Uriah effectively killed in battle. So, but others, I'm not sure. I'd have to sort of think, but the emphasis is much more on how God's people should respond towards foreigners, rather than necessarily foreigners who are behaving badly in Israel. I mean, obviously there are the enemies of Israel who are attacking Israel from outside, the Syrians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and so on. And God says he will deal with them. And in the book of Psalms, of course, the psalmist quite often talks about asking God to deal with his enemies. But they would probably be Israelites rather than foreigners necessarily. So I think in terms of foreigners living in Israel as refugees or immigrants, I'm not sure I can think of any major examples or laws or rules about what happens if they behave badly. They would be treated equally under the law with Israelites, I think. They wouldn't be assumed to be a problem within the country. I don't know if that helps.
Дякую, Крістофере. Пані Людмила, чи є у вас
Людмила,
додаткові
do you have
зауваження,
any
коментар?
more comments or questions about that? If you could maybe voice your question or something. Oh, I see it in chat. Almost everywhere, migrants are mistreated. The attitudes towards them is negative. For example, Russians don't like migrants from Asia. Arabs don't like Jews. Людмила, if you would like to add something.
Так, я,
I
по-перше,
would
дуже хочу
really want
подякувати
to start with a thank you to Dr. Wright for an excellent book he put together. It is such a timely book for Ukraine because right now we are faced with the need of understanding and coming to terms with migration that was forced. And the numbers, statistics are just staggering. We really don't know for sure how many have left Ukraine and were displaced within Ukraine. And I have seen the attitudes of displaced person because I think we kind of transfer our guilt and our misfortunes upon them. So as I would like to address those who have left, those who have stayed, but were displaced, and those who host the migrants, so that people who were forced to move did not feel alienated, did not feel judged, because this is not necessarily what they have chosen. My older son is a migrant. My younger son serves in the army, and there's already tension and misunderstanding, even with them being brothers. What do you think a missiologist has to say using the Bible to perhaps release this tension in this very challenging situation so it doesn't turn into a struggle or even a war between parts of society.
Будь
Dr.
ласка,
Christopher Wright,
Dr. Christopher
please,
Wright, you have the
and
floor.
perhaps Alexander, Ivan, and others. Our family goes through similar processes. We have 11 children. I have 10 more brothers and sisters. Unfortunately, Andrei was killed by Russians, and the family is divided. Some of us are in Poland, in the United States, and I second your question, Ludmila. We have similar questions. I know that some of our participants are live in divided families. Some of their loved ones also left to live in other countries, and these questions are very much on the agenda. Please.
Yes, I think the only comment I would make from a Bible point of view is that I think the book of Exodus shows us that when people like the Hebrew slaves in Egypt were undergoing oppression and suffering and violence, that they easily turned on each other and misunderstood each other. It seems to be a natural reaction. So even when Moses attempts to defend a Hebrew slave being beaten, the next day he comes and they turn on him and say, who made you to be a judge over us? So there's that sense of, and then when they move out into the wilderness, we find the pathology of having been an exploited, violated community surfaces in constant grumbling, in fighting among each other, more anger against Moses, even from within his own family, from Aaron and Miriam, who attack him at one point. So I think what the Bible is showing us is that this is not surprising, because violence, oppression, trauma produces those kind of responses. And I suppose the only thing one can do is to pray for the grace and the love and the understanding of God to fill into people's hearts, so that they're able to recognize that some of these emotions come from depths of being sinned against, the depths of violence against people, not necessarily from a desire to be violent to others. So that's the first thing I would think of. I think the Bible recognizes that syndrome of oppressed and violated people often becoming violent, at least in language and attitudes, even among themselves.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Christopher. Roman Pavlovich, я знаю, що...
Roman, I know you experienced also. Apologies for volunteering you, but perhaps you will be able to comment on this. Yeah, it's one of the most painful issues, especially for churches, and every confession goes through these difficulties in its own way. I have Orthodox priests who ended up abroad during the war, either from borderline regions or occupied regions or front regions, and at this time the Ukrainian Orthodox Church cannot open new churches abroad based on the terms imposed by the patriarch. So it's not easy to find themselves and find self-fulfillment and the church ministry, despite the fact of the sheer number of Ukrainians who ended up abroad. And the same concerns many Protestant churches. It's a very serious challenge. It's not a secret that Donetsk Oblast was one of the most Baptist unions, largest Baptist unions, and dozens and perhaps hundreds of ministers ended up abroad. And it's not a secret that this situation poses many questions. And at this time, we cannot say that we can find answers to all of them. even if we speak of the church aspects of it, how to be with those pastors, what is the right approach, somebody continues their ministry, their pastoral ministry, somebody else does something else. So we cannot find a consolidated answer to this question. At least every other Ukrainian family goes through the same struggle that was mentioned by Ludmila. It's important not to go into the extremes. It's very important to maintain and keep the relationship because it's very easy to sever these ties. As I meet with other people and meet with people, especially those who left before the war or shortly after the war began, and when we come and talk to them with our experience, we very often get the impression that we speak different languages. So it's very important to maintain these relationships, and despite the difficulties, the traumatic experiences that we go through, makes us vulnerable, makes us overly sensitive. We always fall prey to the enemy propaganda and narratives. And we've had experience where the heart of Ukrainian statehood and the ethnicity was maintained in diaspora, and they realized it was important to build and maintain this heritage because it is impossible to do in Ukraine, which was occupied by the Soviet Union. So it's very important to maintain the relations despite the difficulties and different positions, and despite the misunderstandings and sometimes incorrect blame that we have against those who left. Otherwise, it'll be very difficult to rebuild these bridges, especially considering the fact that this war is not over and the long-term forecast may not be as favorable as we may think. Thank you, Roman. Two short questions, one from Ivan Viktorovich Kondrenko. Ivan, could you please voice your question? We went to Donetsk Christian University in 1994, 1997. Perhaps it'll be best to voice this question. What language would you prefer, in English or Ukrainian? In Ukrainian will be best. It's not just a book, but it's a compendium of several authors. Perhaps others know those who went through genocide, not just through suffering or oppression, but through genocide. If those, maybe if you have this information, those who worked on this compendium, do you have any information? As far as I know, thank you for your question, Ivan. Indeed, there were some regional aspects. There's a section of the book that deals with the regional implementations and aspects of diaspora missiology. And there are certain aspects that are connected with genocide or acts of genocide. I did not analyze each individual author in detail, but I believe there were people. There were definitely people who worked in the regions which suffered from aggression or became regions from which people had to flee due to acts of aggression or social cataclysms. And there's a section dedicated to trauma and how it reflects itself in diaspora missiology, in how this traumatic experience can be converted into something positive. So indeed, there's a description of these communities, and there are some theological considerations of this experience. I think you'll be able to find this information there. As I mentioned in my report, in my presentation, I think, and I don't know what it is connected with, but unfortunately, in our missions practices, our Ukrainian experience is yet to be processed and considered. And so, therefore, I would like to invite those who work in the sphere to use and take the tools and instruments available in this manual, in this compendium, and to consider our Ukrainian realities through the prism of these tools. Thank you. Thank you, Ivan. Just a short comment I would like to make. Perhaps something we can do as a follow-up to this compendium presentation, and perhaps this would be best done after the war is over, in dialogue with those who remain in Ukraine or those who became part of diaspora, because there are many layers and levels of attitudes and underlying causes. Why did you leave? What was the primary reason of your immigration? And the same questions can be posed to those who remain in the country. Perhaps it will be the matter of future theological research. The issues of migration are often used for manipulative political or populist rhetoric, and it is often mentioned that the levels of migration are unprecedented, and it's not clear from the question, is it overall or just concerns Ukraine? It will be interesting to think of those who continue to serve God abroad, and what are the ways of how people can adapt. I would like to invite Roman, Ivan, and Alexander to respond to this complex question in the context of our presentation. Perhaps Alexander and Ivan, if you allow me to make a short comment responding to Ivan's questions. Indeed, I took a look at the list of authors, and there's one author who went through genocide in Bhutan. At least, so there's at least one author who went through this traumatic experience. In my report, I also briefly mentioned that this book is not just a conceptual book, is a conceptual manual, but it analyzes practical models and how local church can be involved in serving migrants, in the development of diaspora missiology, and how individual communities which migrate or who are in diaspora, how they, as they think about their mission's purpose, how they can work to continue to expand the kingdom of God. There are some practical instruments and tools available in the book. Considering the fact that this book is part of the Lausanne movement, which unites the global church, this book represents the experience of the global church, and it's not the only book on diaspora that is available in English. I'm hoping there's another textbook, another compendium that would include this global experience. What I like about this particular compendium is that it has in-depth theoretical considerations combined with practical examples and case studies. So this book will definitely be useful for everyone. I would like to comment on the previous questions regarding how to treat those who left the country and those who remain. Based on my experience as an advocate in different countries, I was able to visit many countries and talk to our fellow citizens. What I realize, it's very difficult for me to be abroad when Ukraine suffers from missile attacks. It's I suffer a lot more when I'm abroad than I'm back home in Bucha, notionally speaking. So those who remain in Ukraine, they're traumatized in one way, but those who left, they're traumatized in a different way. And sometimes we cannot acknowledge and recognize the trauma of others. And we need to understand in what ways we can do that. We can recognize this traumatic experience of others. And this can be through mutual understanding, mutual work cooperation, and mutual healing. So therefore, this book is very useful. The biggest disadvantage of this book is that it's lacking Ukrainian experience. On the other hand, I realized that the best research and the best books on diaspora, on Ukrainian diaspora, will be written 20 years ago after we reflect and process this experience. But it is the task for Ukrainian researchers to start thinking about it, start researching, and think about some of the practical solutions that can be offered to our citizen fellow countrymen that are now abroad. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you. I just have one short comment to make. In reality, our evangelical theological community is not a very large one in Ukraine. When we speak of people who are in theology, who are writing books and publications and articles, during the war, we lost to immigration and other circumstances, including military mobilization, drafting. We lost 20 to 25% of our professors, deans, librarians, authors. And so this systemic theological work, especially in conditions of constant stress and pressure, is really difficult. Therefore, having access to these external resources, which summarizes and analyzes all of these tools, is a very useful resource. It offers some practical tools, methodological, practical instruments and tools that we can use for our further research and work. I would really love to see this book to become part of our academic process, perhaps some joint reading, and so that we can use it, so that we are able to use it in our academic process, in our association and unions. Over 100 unions are open, new churches are opened that include Ukrainians who have immigrated abroad, and there's a Council of Evangelical Protestant Churches of Ukraine, which it follows the trends, and we will try and suggest this resource that can potentially be used. If we would hate to see that a lot of this work, all of this work that was invested, and we would hate for this book just to sit in the libraries and not used in practical ministry.
Thank you, Roman. Before I give the floor to Ksenia, who organized this event today, I would like to say a few words too. That countries of Europe, countries of the West have taken in about 7,700,000 Ukrainian refugees, and about 6 million have settled in Europe. Within Ukraine, we have about 6 million IDPs. That's about 25% of the entire population of Ukraine. And as I looked into our experience and our actions of Ukraine as a country, were we hospitable to the refugees before our war began? And my personal opinion is, as Ukrainians, we were a good deal xenophobic towards foreigners. And I would really like to see the next step for our church, and I do mean a church of different traditions, Catholics, Protestants, to start this dialogue and the reimagining of our relationship, not only with diaspora, but also with refugees that are coming in. Perhaps they are different by skin color, perhaps they are different by religion, say they are Muslim. So perhaps our expectations towards Europe, towards states, are lying a bit of intersection of the question of what we are doing to accept refugees within Ukraine, outsiders within Ukraine. And I would really like our theological community to explore this question of diaspora, of interaction in context within the war and then after the war. So this is more of a invitation to a dialogue, to research, to find the answer to such pertinent questions. And I would like to say that our global church is unfortunately not paying as much attention to diaspora, especially the refugees, due to war. And I would really like for this event and for these actions to attract in attention of World Evangelical Alliance, to pay more attention what's going on with the refugees in context of mission of the church and mission of the kingdom of the Lord. And I hope that this brings on for further dialogue. Ksenia? So thank you everybody for moderation, for coming in, for making this event possible. This unique book, of course, it is a big one, but because it's a compilation of articles, you can pick and choose the topic that interests you the most. Nazar will be sharing the Google form that you can fill out in order to order a book. And I would really love to do a book drawing at every of our event. Just for coming in, we're just going to draw a book for a book prize. And today, the winner is Alexander Bilobrovchuk. We will be reaching out to you to arrange the shipping. So congratulations. And I would love to invite you to order this book. And as far as shipping goes, currently we can ship to Europe, but only to the cities where Nova Poshta has its stations. So if you would like to do so, please reach out through email. And if you would like to talk through the ordering and the shipping questions, you can do so through that email. I believe this is it for today. There are more books in the works, perhaps in English, perhaps in Ukrainian, and I'm hoping that the next book drawing will include English-speaking audience as well. So please join us the next time, and I want to wish you safety and Merry Christmas to everyone and victory to Ukrainians. Blessings.